So now let's talk about a few of the different types of networks that are out there. The first type that I want to mention here is something called the client-server network. And again, these days, this is probably the most common network that you will find out there. And the idea behind a client-server network is that each host, and in this case, I'll pretty much refer to that host as a computer, we'll say each computer will act specifically as either a server, which is the provider of the resources, so the computer that's actually sharing the resources, or a client, which is the receiver of those resources, the computer that is accessing the resources. Okay, so in a typical client-server network, each computer is specifically designated as being a server or a client. Now, in the world of Microsoft, very often in a client-server environment, you will have something called Active Directory. Okay, if you've ever heard of that term, Active Directory directory services is what really establishes the framework for this client-server environment. Now, the next type of network I want to talk to you about is something called peer-to-peer. In a peer-to-peer network, every host, and again, we could just say computer in this case, will act as both a client and a server. So what this means in a peer-to-peer environment, every single system, every single computer will have resources that it shares with others, and then it also, that same computer, may access resources from others. This is something that you would find in a very small office, or maybe at home. You may have a peer-to-peer network at home where you have just a few computers around the house and they all have stuff and they can share that stuff with each other. In the world of Microsoft, a peer-to-peer network is commonly referred to as a work group. We also have something called a home group now, which is just a simpler way of understanding how to share resources between the computers, but it's still a peer-to-peer network. And I will also tell you, before we get into the other types of networks, between the client server and the peer-to-peer networks, you usually have, in a typical office environment, you typically have somewhat of a hybrid of the two. Okay, it's typically considered to be a client server network because we have specific servers on that network which will have resources, and then our users will be on individual client computers accessing those resources. But the reason I say it's a bit of a hybrid is because sometimes the servers will share things with other servers. And so if the other server is accessing a resource, well, then technically at the moment it's being a client. And along those same lines, individual client computers, okay, individual employees can be sitting at their own computers, and in certain environments, they can make a resource available to someone else on the network. And that means their client suddenly becomes a server. I don't want this to become too confusing. I want you to understand the definition of client server versus peer-to-peer, but also understand that in the real world, things aren't quite so black and white. Now, some other types of networks I want to go over with you is, this is really, I'd say this is maybe more of a networking term. And this next series here is networking terms that I want you to understand. And the first one is LAN, which stands for Local Area Network. A LAN refers to a network contained within a building. This doesn't necessarily have to be the case. I have seen environments where the local area network is just one floor of a building or just one room in a building. But basically the idea here is with a local area network, you have a bunch of computers all connected on a single high-speed network. Now, I think a LAN will become a little bit more clear when we go through some of these others, more specifically when we get to something called a WAN, which is a wide area network. Before we talk about the wide area network, I want to talk about a couple other networks that are in between. And these are terms that are not really used too much anymore, but just so you can have the foundation of the terminology that has been out there over the years, I want to cover these others with you. One of them is called a CAN, a Campus Area Network. And this is a network that is spread between multiple buildings, but to be more specific, it's between multiple contiguous buildings. Okay, so we've now expanded beyond the local area network. We've gone into additional buildings, but all of these buildings are all together on a single property. Matter of fact, if you think of the term campus, whether it be a business campus or maybe a school campus, that typically means that there's a bunch of buildings, but they're all on the same property. Expanding out from there, we have the MAN, which is a metropolitan area network. And this is a network that is spread between multiple non-contiguous buildings, but we're still contained within a single metropolitan area. Okay, so if you have networks in more than one location, but still typically within a single metropolitan area, so within a city, that's considered a MAN. Now, this is a term that's not used much anymore, and the reason why is because it was originally developed because we had dial-up communications between the networks. And so a metropolitan area network meant that those dial-up calls that were being made between the different buildings were all local calls and not long distance calls. Okay, that's why we had this network established. Now, I will also tell you that there's another type of network that is referred to as a MAN, M-A-N, and that's a mobile area network. And I'm not going to go into it, but basically that's something that's a little more modern and has to do with mobile communications and being able to keep track of signals with vehicles traveling. So a very good example would be maybe a train. Okay, as the train is traveling, being able to maintain communication along the track. All right, so now that you know about the CAN and the MAN, and again, that's probably more of a history lesson than a current lesson, let's now talk about the WAN, the Wide Area Network. This is a network that is spread over a wide area, typically covering multiple cities and sometimes even over multiple countries around the world. So how do you really know what's a LAN and what's a WAN, right? Because there is no absolute definition, right? The LAN is, it might be within a building, but if we go to multiple buildings, are we really in a WAN? Really, the way I want you to think about it is if the network is all connected with internal cabling and with high-speed connectivity. And by the way, we'll talk about cabling in a little bit, and we'll talk about how the cables don't necessarily have to be physical cables. They could be airwaves. But if it's all high-speed connection, then it's a LAN. And as soon as you go into a slower connection, very often provided by a third-party provider, like your ISP, where maybe you're connecting across the internet, or maybe you have a dedicated T1 or T3 line, something like that. Now you're part of a WAN. And again, I don't want you to get too caught up on any of this. I'm trying to give you all the literals and hopefully not confusing you at the same time, because it's really actually quite simple. Okay, LAN, local, WAN is wide.